They say the higher you climb, the lonelier the air becomes. And for Ethan Cole Montgomery, loneliness wasn't just a feeling. It was home. New York City stretched beneath him, restless, glowing, untouchable. From the 42nd floor of a glass tower, he stood barefoot on the balcony, his reflection caught between storm clouds and city lights. It was the kind of view people dreamed of, and the kind of silence only the powerful could afford. He looked perfect. The undone tux, the loosened tie, the watch gleaming under the moonlight. But his eyes told a different story. The story of a man who had everything, and yet nothing that mattered. He exhaled slowly. All this and I still can't sleep. Behind him, his penthouse looked immaculate. Glass walls, untouched wine, headlines framed in gold. Every inch screamed success, yet somehow it felt more like a museum than a home. On the bar counter, a folded newspaper read, "Ethan Montgomery, the future of the empire." He stared at his own name for a long moment before turning away. He was born into a world that measured love in assets and loyalty in stocks. A world where smiles were rehearsed and affection came with contracts. Far below, the city pulsed with life, car horns, laughter, and music floating through the rain. Ethan leaned against the glass, watching strangers live lives he could never have. For a fleeting second, he wondered what it felt like to be broke, unseen, and free. His phone buzzed. Board meeting, 8 a.m. He silenced it without looking. 8 a.m. Another day pretending. The Montgomery Group, a legacy older than his conscience. Founded by his grandfather, expanded by his father, now resting on his shoulders. He was the face of the future, but lately, the man in the mirror looked like someone trying to remember who he used to be before the cameras came. There were flashes of memory, charity galas, champagne toasts, blinding camera lights. A life so polished it almost looked fake. Because it was. Everyone wanted a piece of the air. The board wanted his decisions. The press wanted his image. Women wanted his name. But not one person ever asked if he was happy. Rain began to fall, soft and cold against his skin. He didn't move. He let it wash over him, quiet and cleansing. That night, while the city chased its dreams, Ethan Montgomery stopped pretending he had one. He walked back inside, the marble floor cold under his feet. The hallway was lined with portraits of men who looked just like him. Stern, confident, lifeless. At the end of the hall, one painting stood apart. A cityscape painted by his late mother. He stopped there. His fingers brushed the edge of the frame. She used to say, "Never let the world tell you who you are, Ethan." He never knew how hard that would be. Until now. Outside, lightning tore across the skyline. The camera of life moved downward through the storm, to a quiet street below, small, glowing in café light. Inside that café, a young woman sketched alone at a corner table. Her name was Lila Grace Carter. Her hair was tied in a messy bun, her sleeves rolled, her eyes fixed on a page that only she understood. She didn't belong to the city's chaos. She created her own calm. The waitress asked if she was still there. Lila smiled faintly and said, "Just one more line." Her pencil moved with quiet intention, shaping something beautiful and real. And at that same moment, above her, Ethan looked down from his balcony. His gaze lost in the lights, unaware that just a few blocks away, someone was about to change everything he thought he knew about love. They say destiny moves quietly, between raindrops, through late nights, in places no one notices. And that night, the storm carried more than thunder. Ethan stood by the window, distant and weary. His champagne glass was still full, untouched. A single raindrop slid down the glass, like a tear the world didn't deserve to see. He had everything money could buy, but nothing his soul could keep. Ethan Cole Montgomery was born into a world already written for him. From the moment he opened his eyes, his name carried more weight than most men would ever know. The Montgomery family wasn't just wealthy. They were legacy carved into the skyline of America. Their buildings touched clouds, their signatures built industries, and their influence quietly shaped laws no one ever saw being written. But even as a child, Ethan felt the pressure of perfection. Every handshake was a lesson, every smile a performance. His father believed emotion was a weakness, and his grandfather treated affection as a distraction. Success, he was told, was not about happiness. It was about control. By age 10, he had learned to wear suits better than his own skin. By 18, he could read balance sheets faster than his thoughts. And by 21, he had already become the face of the Montgomery Empire. A carefully molded image, admired by the public, envied by rivals, and pitted by no one. The cameras loved him, but he never loved himself in front of them. To the world, Ethan was the definition of the American dream. To himself, he was a man trapped inside it. He remembered sitting in his father's office one night, staring at the city lights below. His father spoke of expansion, mergers, profits, all the things that kept the empire alive. But the only thing Ethan heard that night was the sound of his own silence. The realization that no one in that room ever asked him what he wanted. He wanted peace. He wanted to breathe without performance. He wanted a life that didn't feel like a press release. When his father passed away, the empire became his by blood, but the emptiness stayed. People came with condolences that sounded more like business proposals. They spoke of the future, of what he could achieve, never of what he might feel. The funeral became another meeting, another stage. Ethan smiled through it because that's what Montgomery men were trained to do. As the years moved forward, success became routine. He bought companies, saved investors, attended charity galas, and dated women who understood contracts better than commitment. But every victory tasted the same, dull, fleeting, and cold. Behind every headline, there was a loneliness no one saw. Behind every celebration, a silence that grew louder each night. He lived in a house full of servants but had no one who truly knew him. Even his friends were careful around him, their words rehearsed, their laughter measured. Being an heir meant never knowing who cared about the man and who wanted the fortune. In quiet moments, Ethan would look out over the city and wonder what it felt like to live without being watched. He envied the people who could walk into a diner and order without being photographed. The ones who could make mistakes without seeing them printed the next day. His grandfather, Charles Montgomery, saw his uncertainty as weakness. To him, love, rest, and freedom were luxuries the family couldn't afford. "Our name must always stand taller than our emotions," he often said. And so Ethan built walls around his heart, not to protect it, but to hide it. There were nights when he'd drive alone through neighborhoods far from his own, where lights flickered softly behind old curtains and laughter drifted out of small apartment windows. He would watch them from his car, the families eating dinner together, the friends sitting on porches, the simple chaos of real life. He didn't belong there, but somehow that world felt more alive than his own. Ethan had everything a man could desire: influence, luxury, power. Yet he felt invisible in his own story. The people around him saw a brand, not a human. They admired his posture, not his pulse. He was a man who could buy anything except meaning. And then came the night at the art café. The same night the city rained harder than it had in weeks. He had been driving aimlessly, escaping the hollow noise of a corporate dinner, when he saw the soft light spilling through the café's window. Something about it felt different, unguarded, almost human. He parked, stepped inside, and for the first time in years, no one recognized him. There were no flashes, no whispers, no expectations. Just the smell of coffee and the faint sound of jazz. He ordered the simplest thing he could, a black coffee, and sat near the back. That's when he saw her. Lila Grace Carter. She wasn't dressed to impress anyone, wasn't trying to be noticed, and that's what made her impossible to ignore. She sat by the window sketching something on a worn notebook. There was a calmness around her that didn't belong to the city. Ethan watched her for a moment, not out of arrogance, but curiosity. It wasn't the kind of attraction built on beauty. It was built on peace, something his world never gave him. He didn't speak to her that night. He didn't have to. Something in that silence between them already said enough. When he left the cafe, the rain had stopped. The streets were wet, shining under the dim streetlights. He looked up, and for the first time in years he smiled. Not for a camera, not for a headline, but for himself. What he didn't know then was that the quiet girl by the window would soon rewrite the story he thought was his destiny. She would challenge the empire he inherited, the rules he obeyed, and the life he thought he had to live. That night, as he drove away, the city still glittered behind him, but for the first time, he didn't feel like part of it. Something inside him had shifted. A small, fragile spark in a man who had forgotten what warmth felt like. And in that fragile beginning, hidden beneath the noise of power and the silence of wealth, love had already begun to whisper his name. They say some moments pass like wind, quiet, invisible, but leave everything changed. For Ethan Cole Montgomery, that night at the cafe refused to fade. Days later, his world still looked the same. Meetings, boardrooms, endless faces with smiles that never reached their eyes. But something in him had shifted. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way the rain had stopped when he saw her. Maybe it was her calm, the kind that didn't ask for attention but somehow demanded it. Whatever it was, Lila Grace Carter had stayed in his thoughts like a song with no words. At the Montgomery Tower, his assistant listed his scheduled conference calls, investor dinners, interviews. He nodded, pretending to listen, but his mind was elsewhere. Back in that cafe. Back to the way she looked at her sketchbook like it was the only truth left in the world. He didn't even know her name then. Didn't know if he'd ever see her again. But something told him he would. And he did. 2 weeks later, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Ethan walked into that same cafe. Not for coffee this time, but for answers he didn't even know he was asking. She was there. Same table. Same window. Only this time she wasn't sketching. She was staring out, lost in thought. He hesitated, the air of an empire, nervous over a stranger. Then he walked over. "Is this seat taken?" She looked up, surprised, then smiled. A small, genuine curve of lips that made the world soften around her. "No," she said. "But it's not free either." He raised a brow. "What's the price?" "Honest company," she replied, turning back to the window. For the first time in years, Ethan sat with someone who didn't ask for anything beyond presence. No agenda, no reputation, just two people sharing a small piece of quiet in a noisy city. They talked about small things first. The rain, the taste of New York coffee, the way time moved too fast when you weren't paying attention. Then came the silence. Not awkward, but peaceful. He watched her sketch again, the pencil dancing across the page like it knew secrets the world forgot. "What are you drawing?" he asked. She looked up. "Something I don't want to forget." He leaned closer, just enough to see the paper. It was him the night it rained, standing outside the cafe, hands in pockets, lost in thought. He froze. "You remember that?" She smiled softly. "You looked like someone trying to find something he didn't believe existed." He didn't answer. He couldn't. For a man who lived surrounded by cameras, it was the first time he'd seen himself through someone else's eyes. Not as a billionaire, not as a brand, but as a person. They talked until the cafe lights dimmed. And when he finally stood to leave, Lila said something that stayed long after the door closed behind him. "Don't forget to live while you're trying to build a life." That night, Ethan didn't go home to his penthouse. He drove with no destination, windows down, rain on his face, her words echoing in his mind. He didn't understand it yet, but something fragile had begun to grow. Not love, not yet, but something more dangerous. Hope. They met again a week later, same place, same time. This time, she ordered for both of them before he arrived. He laughed when he saw it. "You're getting used to my habits already. Maybe I just like consistency," she said, eyes glinting. Their talks grew deeper. He learned that she was an artist who worked part-time at a gallery downtown, barely making enough to cover rent but rich in peace. She learned that he hated his boardroom more than he loved his view. He started visiting more often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just to sit in silence. Each visit peeled away a layer he didn't know he had. And then, one evening, as they sat by the window watching people hurry through puddles, Lila asked, "Why do you always look like you're somewhere else?" He hesitated. "Because I am. Every day, I live in a place I don't belong." She didn't push, just nodded. "Then maybe it's time you start building a place that feels like you." Her words landed heavier than she knew. Ethan went home that night and stared at the skyline from his balcony. The rain had stopped again, but the city still shimmered with reflections. Millions of lives overlapping, none truly touching. He realized he'd spent years building towers that scraped the sky but never touched the ground. For once, he wanted to start at the ground. But peace doesn't go unnoticed in a world built on control. The next morning, his assistant knocked, holding a tablet. "Sir, there's something you should see." On the screen, a photo. Ethan, sitting across from Lila in the café, laughing. Below it, a headline already forming on a gossip site. "Montgomery Heir seen with mystery woman. Who is she?" His chest tightened. He'd been careful. He thought no one was watching. But the city always watched. He didn't say a word, just nodded, dismissed the assistant, and sat alone in silence. For the first time, he realized what the cost of peace might be. Lila had no idea who he really was, not the press version, not the empire, not the weight of the name. And if she found out this way, it would destroy the only honest thing he'd ever found. That evening, he returned to the café. She was there again, sketching, humming quietly. She looked up, smiled, and said, "You look tired." He sat down slowly. "Long day," but his voice lacked its usual calm. She noticed but didn't ask. Instead, she said, "You don't have to carry everything alone, you know?" He almost told her then. The truth, the name, the world waiting to swallow them both. But the words wouldn't come. He just smiled weakly and said, "Some weights don't belong to other people." When he left that night, he checked his phone again. The headline had spread. Hundreds of comments. Speculation. Rumors. His world, the one he'd tried to escape, was already creeping toward hers. In her apartment across town, Lila closed her sketchbook and looked at the small note still tucked inside. His name, written in careful ink. She didn't know what storm was about to come for her quiet life. And somewhere above the city, in a glass tower touching the clouds, Ethan stared at his reflection and whispered, "I should have walked away when it was still simple." They say some people enter your life like light through a crack. Gentle, healing, dangerous. And when that light touches a place the world has kept dark too long, the world always fights back. He didn't know it yet, but the empire was already watching. And soon, the man who had everything would have to choose between the life he inherited and the love that made him human again. They say peace never lasts long when the world starts to pay attention. For Ethan Cole Montgomery, that fragile peace shattered faster than he could breathe. It began with a single photograph, grainy, harmless, but powerful enough to wake a sleeping storm. A picture of him, sitting in a quiet cafe, smiling at a woman who didn't belong to his world. Lila Grace Carter. By morning, her name was everywhere. Whispers became stories, and stories became headlines. The heir of the Montgomery Empire had been seen with a girl the tabloids called ordinary. But in his world, ordinary was a scandal. The cameras came first, then the voices. They filled the sidewalks outside his company, the gates near his mansion, and every corner where his name once stood clean and controlled. The same people who praised him yesterday now questioned his judgment today. And the same silence that once protected him began to feel like a cage. Inside the Montgomery estate, the atmosphere grew colder than marble. His grandfather, Charles Montgomery, had spent a lifetime turning legacy into law. And in his eyes, Ethan had broken both. There were no raised voices, only words sharp enough to cut through bone. Honor, reputation, power. The same empty words Ethan had been raised to worship. They told him love was a distraction, that emotion was weakness, that image was everything. But for the first time, Ethan saw the cracks in their perfect mirror. He saw what control cost, and he wasn't sure he wanted to pay it anymore. Still, he said nothing. He stood in silence as generations before him had done. Because in his family, silence wasn't cowardice, it was tradition. A way to survive. Outside, the city roared. Lila's face appeared on screens, her name twisted into something she never chose. Her small art page, once hidden and beautiful, became a battlefield of opinions. Strangers picked her apart, searching for proof that she wasn't worthy of someone like him. And though Ethan wanted to defend her, he knew his words would only make it worse. Sometimes in his world, protection meant pretending not to care. Days blurred together. Meetings resumed. Interviews continued. But every time the cameras flashed, he felt emptier. The smile they wanted from him no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the name he carried. A name heavy enough to crush the man beneath it. Then came the press release. Cold. Polished, perfect. It called the story a misunderstanding. It called her a friend. And though he never approved it, the world believed it anyway. That day, something inside Ethan broke. Not loudly, not visibly, just a quiet fracture deep within his soul, the kind that changes a man forever. He went back to the café, hoping for some trace of her. The same window, the same rain. But she was gone. Her chair was empty, her laughter replaced by the low hum of strangers who didn't know her name. He sat there for hours, surrounded by noise, yet completely alone. For a man who once owned the world, he had never felt smaller. He realized that his silence had not protected her. It had erased her. They say power gives you control over everything. But no one tells you how powerless it feels when the only thing you want is forgiveness. Ethan would have traded every tower, every dollar, every headline, just to hear her voice one more time. But life doesn't wait for regret. It moves forward, indifferent, leaving behind the hearts too slow to keep up. And Ethan, once the image of perfection, now walked through his days like a shadow wearing his own face. At night, he stopped answering calls, stopped attending events. He'd stare out from his penthouse window, the city lights below shimmering like ghosts of the life he almost had. Each light reminded him of her, soft, fleeting, unreachable. He had the world at his feet, but not the one person who made it feel alive. When his grandfather called again, it wasn't to ask how he was. It was to congratulate him for doing the right thing, for salvaging the family name. Ethan listened in silence, then looked out over the skyline his family built and wondered, what was the point of standing so tall if you had no one beside you to see the view? They say every empire has a price, and the Montgomerys had paid theirs with love. Generation after generation, they traded connection for control, until the family name became both crown and curse. As rain began to fall again, Ethan realized that silence, the very thing he was taught to master, was the one thing destroying him. He had learned to speak in contracts, smile through lies, and live without asking. But he had never learned how to lose something real. That night, he sat in the dark, the storm raging outside like it had waited for him. He closed his eyes and saw her again. Lila, sketching by the window, peaceful, unbothered by the world. And in that image he found the truth his family feared most. Love was never his weakness. It was his rebellion. The storm outside grew louder, beating against the glass as if trying to reach him. He let it. For once, he didn't hide from it. He let the noise drown out the silence. Because sometimes you don't heal by building walls. You heal by letting everything fall. They say some storms come to destroy, but others come to reveal. And as the rain poured over the city that carried his name, Ethan realized his silence had finally spoken. Not to the world, but to himself. He didn't know where she was. Didn't know if she still thought of him. But he knew one thing for certain. He would never let silence win again. They called it a scandal. He called it the moment he finally became human. They say the world only remembers the powerful. But sometimes the quiet ones leave the deepest scars. Lila Grace Carter never wanted to be seen. Her art was her voice. Soft, deliberate, and private. She spent years sketching faces she'd never meet, lives she'd never live. Until one night, the world decided to look back at her. The photograph appeared on every screen before she even knew it existed. A single image, her sitting by a café window, smiling at a man the world called untouchable. Ethan Cole Montgomery. To her, he had simply been the stranger who listened. To everyone else, he was a headline waiting to explode. The noise came fast. Reporters outside her door. Messages from strangers she never met. Some called her lucky. Some called her a liar. Most called her things she couldn't repeat. She tried to ignore it, turned off her phone, locked her studio, and drew until her hands shook. But even silence has a sound when the whole world is talking about you. Every article painted her as something different. A social climber, a scandal, a distraction. None of them painted her as what she really was, human. At night, she'd stare at her sketches, wondering how something so innocent had turned into chaos. And the cruelest part wasn't the lies. It was the truth, that she missed him. The man who looked at her without calculation. The man who saw her art before her face. She had told herself it was just a moment. But moments have a way of growing into memories that refuse to leave. When the press statement came, a misunderstanding, they called it. She didn't cry. She just stood there, reading the words he never said, and felt something inside her go quiet. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. Not in him, but in the world that made him choose silence. She left the city that night, packed her sketches, her pencils, and one photograph, the one she'd drawn of him standing in the rain. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed distance to remember who she was before his world found her. The train hummed softly as it left New York behind. Rain streaked the windows, blurring the skyline into watercolors of gold and gray. Somewhere out there, he was still living in that tower of glass. And somewhere deep inside her, she wished he wasn't. Weeks passed. The noise faded. And for the first time, peace didn't feel borrowed. She found a small apartment above a flower shop in a quiet town where no one cared about headlines. Mornings smelled like coffee and roses. Nights hummed with cicadas instead of sirens. She painted again, not for fame, not for approval, just for the sake of remembering how it felt to create without fear. Her sketches changed. The lines grew softer, the colors warmer. But one face kept appearing on every canvas, his. Ethan, standing beneath the rain, always looking at something beyond her frame. She tried to erase him once. She couldn't. Sometimes she'd laugh at herself, at how ridiculous it was to miss someone who probably moved on. Someone born into a world where people like her didn't last. But then she'd remember the way he looked at her. Not like an heir, but like a man finally breathing. and that memory was enough to keep her heart from hardening. Until one morning, everything changed again. It was a Tuesday. The sky was gray, heavy with storm clouds that felt almost familiar. She was arranging her new paintings for a small local exhibit, her first in years. As she hung the final canvas, she noticed something unusual. A letter had been slipped under the door. No name, no return address, just her name written in clean, deliberate handwriting. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside, a single photograph. The same cafe window from months ago, empty now. And on the back, 5 words written in pen. Some storms don't end, Lila. No signature, no explanation, just that. She stood there, staring at the photograph, the air around her suddenly heavier. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant hills, soft but certain. Someone had found her, or maybe someone never stopped looking. She pressed the letter to her chest, torn between fear and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Because deep down, she knew that handwriting. She had seen it once, on a napkin months ago, in a cafe filled with rain. The name didn't need to be written. She already knew who it belonged to. Her heart raced, but her mind whispered caution. She had rebuilt her peace. Did she dare let him back in? The storm outside grew louder, wind brushing against the window like a memory come alive. She closed her eyes and whispered to the silence, as if he could somehow hear her. Why now, Ethan? They say some stories don't end. They just wait for the next chapter to find them. And as the rain began to fall again, Lila realized her story wasn't over. It was only catching its breath. Because sometimes, love doesn't disappear. It hides in the spaces between storms. And somewhere under the same rain, Ethan Cole Montgomery had just made a choice that would change everything. To be continued. Echoes of Realities by Achiever.
Subscribe for more echoes.